Duncan's been grinding that G10. It's obviously got a bit of G10 in there. I've just got a waft of burning G10 there.
Probably got film on it, so we do it, haven't we? That's true, yeah. Separate shelving like that. Is there any more done to your gas forge?
So it's a gas forge, but I've just plugged it in because this one's got what they call a trimmer on it, which is effectively a little electric fan. So it means you can regulate the heat, the amount of gas that it uses. It's just really, really, really groovy actually. And these are made not far from here actually, Tewkesbury. A guy called Cecil Swan, he's a South African, and he's a farrier. So they're designed for blacksmiths. They're designed as a portable farrier's forge, so they can go in the back of the rig. So if they're fitted shoes, they can have it in the back of their van, and they're away. I like it because it's really self-contained. Back home in the workshop, it stays relatively cool. It's not like you've got a blazing hearth all day in your workshop making it really hot. So it's quite good, really.
Got 2 jets.
2 jets. You can get a single burner or a double burner. I went for the double burner in the end.
Does your bacon lovely? We sort of like run across and shovel.
Grab a few of the necessary bits and pieces. A great big kukuri knife or parang or whatever, but I wanted to just show you how we could simply forge some very crude little stick tang blades, and then we'll show you how we grind it, and then we'll just heat treat it in a really sort of basic way. Really, we're not going to do anything elaborate really, but hopefully it'll give you the idea of what's possible. I was going to try and get one of these little fire bricks. You've probably seen it on the internet and stuff. They hollow these fire bricks out and just use one of these matte gas plumber's blowtorches, and you've got enough heat to forge simple little blades like that, but I could never got round to ordering the bricks, so I thought I'd bring the old faithful forge again. So what we use for steel for the blades, you can use spring steel, old files. I used to get a lot of old coil springs from the local garage and stuff, but what I've started to do now is just buy like virgin spring steel in from Sheffield, because I can get a nice straight long length. I haven't got to burn all the paint off, and I haven't got to straighten it to start with. So this is EN43, EN45, which is basically the same as what's on your Land Rover or on your car. But if you want to do it on the cheap, go down to your local Quick Fit, and they'll give you some broken springs, especially if you take them in a box of biscuits and some tea bags. You know, they'll be friends for life. So what we'll do is we'll pop this in here, put the power on. It'll take a while to warm up, so we'll get that in now, and we'll show you how we go about it. You'll have to bear with me because I don't do a great deal of forging anymore. I used to do a lot more of it, but mostly it's sort of stock removal and things like that now, so it's not something I do. We should have got Dave to do it, shouldn't we? We should have got Dave Budd to do it. He'd have shown you how to do it properly. The biggest limitations that you've got when you're demoing at an event like this is I'm not going to bring my 25 kilo anvil along, so I bought this cheap and cheerful little mobile one from Machine Mart. It's about 5 kilos, I think. It's hardly any weight at all, but it's only about 30 quid, so it's big enough. But the main thing to do is stick it on a heavy stump, or if you've got an old tree in your garden and the roots are still going into the ground, use that, because that's going to be great. Or if you have got to make it mobile, see if you can stick it on some concrete or something like that, and it'll just stop all that energy going through your workpiece. Well, I couldn't remember which tongs I used, so I ended up bringing all of them. But what we'll do is we'll chuck a bit of this in there as well.
What colour heat can you get up to on this?
Somebody else asked me that, and I never really know. I never really know the temperatures because you sort of gauge it more by colour, really. But I think
what colour can you get to? Is what I'm saying.
Well, you can get it up to welding heat.
Yellow heat.
Yeah, you can get it up to yellow in there.
Yeah.
If you are going to weld with these, they recommend that you put a sacrificial tile in there because the flux can sort of melt all the insulation out of it. But I don't really do any of that, so. But
so you
yeah,
get yellow heat.
You can get yellow heat up there with that. So we'll see what we can do. So it don't take long for it to heat up. And the great thing about this versus your charcoal kiln or your coke forge is I can leave 2 or 3 pieces of steel in there, all up to working temperature, with no fear of me pulling it out and just having like a sparkler on the end. That's a real pain in the bum if that happens. So it means that the production is up. And when I went to see these, he let me have a go with one for an hour before I bought it. And he kept saying that I'd never be able to keep up with it. Because I was saying I was fed up of having to wait for steel to heat up. And he said, Nick, you'll never be able to keep up with this. He said, your arm will drop off before you beat the forge. And it's true, really. You can't hammer quick enough. So what we'll do is we'll use the cross peen of the hammer to start to flatten and draw this bar out. And you can see this is why the light anvil is the pain. You can see how much energy is being lost due to the fact that this is bouncing. With my big heavy anvil back at home on a solid concrete floor and things, there's no energy being lost. Oops. This is half the battle. With round bar, it spends more time rolling around than anything else. Use my other tongs actually. But if you've got 2 or 3 on the go, you don't have to wait, you see. And the choice is yours, how thin you take it. But what you've got to try and do when you're forging is you always work in 2 planes. So I draw it out one way and then I flatten off those sides. If you just hit it any which way and you create a little lip that will fold over and then you hammer it flat, it won't look like it, but you'll have created a little crack in there. And that's not what you want.
Is that the fan or is it the gas?
I don't think my fan's working, is it? No, my fan's stopped working for some reason. I lent this to somebody the other day, so that's normally the... I think somebody's turned the power off. That'll be a pain because it'll stop the. I won't be able to do the grind. Let's just plug that in. See if that cable's still working. We have power this morning.
Yeah, I saw you, haven't you?
No, we've got no power. They've obviously turned the power off to the market. They are, I couldn't understand why they did it. Is there a willing volunteer?
Yep.
Yeah? Somebody going to go and see if we can get the power, because otherwise the grinding demo is going to be real pants. I couldn't understand why you weren't doing anything. Because normally it'd be roaring and you could get it nice and off in seconds. Anyway, while they're figuring that out, we'll draw this out a little bit more. Now, some people will spend a lot of time forging out the blade, and if you wanted to, and you wanted to forge a lot of the bevels in, then what you'd actually do is you'd shape this side so that you'd end up with a drop on the top, flat on the bottom, and then you'd actually hammer along that flat edge to create your bevel, And what would happen is, as you forge along there, it will bring the tip back up again. If you make what looks like a knife and then forge along what looks like the cutting edge, you'll end up with this blade that curves right round the opposite way. Because we're going to do a sort of more traditional flat grind, Scandi grind, I want to leave a bit more extra material, so I'm not going to forge any bevels in, because I want to be able to grind it all on there. So we'll see when that red light comes on, I know that we've got power then. So we'll take this down to about, I don't know, 2 or 3 mil, something like that. And this is probably the worst kind of light to work in. It won't actually look like it's very hot at all. You'll only know it if you've picked it up. The blacksmith told me once, he says, you never pick anything up in a blacksmith shop until you spit on it, because you don't know whether it's sort of dull red or cold. So we'll do a little bit of forging on this one while that one's heating up. We'll see which one comes out the best. This one's slightly thicker bar. I just remembered I forgot my little logo, my little stamp that I normally put into the blades, but somebody was asking me the other day about getting a little forge set up, and I was saying what to get for an anvil, and I was saying, well, you can actually just source lumps of offcuts of marble and things like that, and you think, well, I can't forge on stone, it's got to be metal, but a lot of the Japanese smiths will use stone. You just got to make sure that you don't strike it afterwards. Forge that down a little bit more, and then what we'll do is we'll heat it up and we'll snip it off on that cutter, and then we'll turn it round and we'll start to create the tang then. So what I tend to do is, once I get it how I want it, this final sort of few strikes with the hammer are to straighten it, but they also put a nice finish on there as well. It almost sort of like polishes the steel. So we'll heat that up and we'll snip that off. We've got power. Still no power. We are doing a little article in, I think it was this issue of the Bushcraft magazine that's just come out, how to make yourself a little charcoal hearth in your garden. And then this issue we're going to do forging a little blade, and then putting the handle on it, and then making the sheath. So basically you've got a little precursor of what's going to be in the Bushcraft magazine basically. But it's quite good fun. What I've found is you can get people sort of back to how they sort of almost in your soul really, heating up bits of metal in a fire and hitting it with a big hammer. It's sort of in your very being, you know.
Yeah, that's low.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. I know what I've got to put in there as well. We'll chuck this in there as well. We're going to need that. We're going to need that later. So we'll get that heated up now.
What is that?
It's just a little scrap block of steel. Nothing special, but it'll take a while for it to heat up, so we'll get that in now.
Where do you get your tongs?
Yeah, don't pick those ones up. If you were back home in the workshop, you could use the bandsaw to cut it off, but the fact that we've got the heat, we may as well use the hot cutter, so we can just snip that off. Pop that back in there, we might make something else out of it. And then we'll turn it round. What I advise to people, when you're learning, the most difficult thing is actually keeping hold of the tongs, hold of the metal, whilst you're concentrating on hitting. So if you can, you get yourself some sort of cheap mole grips. I wouldn't necessarily clamp it on and hold it there because these will get red hot, but you can just clamp those on and it will make learning the actual hitting side of things a hell of a lot easier. It gets really quite awkward when you're trying to figure out how to hold the steel in the right place and strike it at the same time. Another thing that you can do as well, there's quite an interesting book, and it's how to teach yourself blacksmithing without any heat. It shows you how to do it with plasticine and little wooden hammers, because basically plasticine will move in exactly the same way that hot steel will. So you can sort of teach yourself how to manipulate it and where to strike it in order to make it do certain things and shapes and things. I've never tried that actually. Maybe I should have done a plasticine demo rather than bring all this heavy stuff. Wouldn't have been quite as interesting, I don't think. So we'll just try and draw that tang down a little bit. And I'm trying to use the side of the anvil to create a sort of shoulder. So I'm trying to strike with the hammer there and on the opposite side on the anvil, and that will create my sort of shoulder for my tang. And if anything, you want to make sure that it's thickest and it's widest at the point where the blade is, and then it wants to taper down. If you have it fat here, you're going to have a real job fitting it. Probably lose that now as well. Still no.
Should we get the maintenance bloke to turn it back on?
Is he going to put it on? Is
That's what they call in the town walkie-talkie then.
Might be a part 1 and a part 2 when we get power in it.
There's some bellows.
It was funny, we had a lightning storm the other day. Of course the power goes off and I think, oh never mind, that don't matter, I'll just go and grind some blades. Oh hang on, no, I can't do that. And I'm thinking, oh I'll do something else. Oh no, I can't do that either. And I'm thinking I should have had the old Jenny fired up, you know. So, you don't realise how much you rely on it. And what you want to try and do, it's quite a difficult technique, but there's a technique where you lift the steel off at the strike at the same time, so that the anvil doesn't suck the heat away from your steel. But it's a bit like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time. That is. That's not looking too bad now. So we'll just make sure that it's straight along its whole length. That don't look too bad. And like I say, we've got it thickest here, where it meets those shoulders, and then it tapers down both ways really. So the beauty of forging something is you can make it thick where you need it, take it thin where you want a nice thin delicate tip, and it all looks and works perfectly then. Normally what I would do, when it gets to that stage, you don't want to cool that too quickly. So normally what I'd do is I'd pop it on the edge of the forge so it'd cool very, very, very slowly. Because we want to work it a little bit faster, I'll leave it on the anvil, and the anvil will suck a bit of that heat away. Is it going to be a blade? If not, we'll just take that cable and we'll run it in. We'll run it indoors. I think I've got enough cable. Go this way.
It's 50 metres.
You can unplug that grinder a minute for us, could you? That'd be great. There you go. Fantastic. Blue Peter never had this trouble, did they? You know? Right. I'll just go and plug my lead in and then I'll be back. Oh well, should be a plug just right on its stand. So this is what it should have sounded like when you got the fan. So you can turn that down to nothing basically when you got the fan running, and you can still keep it ticking over. He says confidently. So it's lovely. You can tweak it, and like if you are welding, you can tweak it so you can either get a neutral flame or an oxygen-rich flame, whatever you want really. But we don't really need that anymore, so we'll get onto the job in hand. So at that stage, when it's coolish, that's cold enough to pick up now. So just by leaving it on there, it's just sucked all that heat away. I've got a feeling my bucket might have a hole in it, you know, because it was a lot fuller than that when I started. So at that stage, before we've done any kind of heat treatment to it, it's pretty much, it's not in its annealed form because we let it cool a bit too quickly, but if we'd have let it cool nice and slowly, it would have been in its normalised state, and then we could do all our grinding on it. So, I'll plug this in. And I've got some various tooling for this grinder which will make it a little bit easier. Sorry mate, the fan was plugged in the other end now, I don't know why. Oh, it's working now. Fantastic, thanks a lot. Excellent, so I think we'll be alright now. That's the almost done now. Thanks a lot. So with this grinder we can put various little fences on there and tool rests, which will make it a lot easier to support this blade while we grind it. And simple things in life, as you learn, when you first start you try to use your fingers a lot and you end up burning them. So it's much easier if you can to use yourself a little push stick. And what we're going to do is we're going to grind whatever blade shape we want on there. And if you were putting a sort of collar on there, or you wanted a much neater fit to your handle, you could grind a little shoulder in there as well. So we'll do that. And what works quite nicely is if you just take off those sharp corners. One, it will make it nicer to handle, but it will make it a bit easier to fit the handle as well. So we've got that nice shoulder now. Ideally, if you wanted to, you'd put a straight edge on it so that you make sure that they match up. You don't want one shoulder being a lot in front of the other, because when you fit the handle you'll end up with this horrible unsightly little gap. So just round that back edge a little bit. start making our cutting it. So we're starting to get the shape that we want. Just need to make sure that we go back to the shiny steel so I can get a really nice crisp edge on there. If we started to grind the bevels now, while we've still got that divot, you'd end up with a wobble in the actual cutting edge itself. So. Okay, so we're back to nice shiny steel now. So we'll kill that. Don't really, I know a lot of people do, they use jigs and tables and things, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just I've never got into that. So I just do it sort of old school. And I'm going to grind, I'm right-handed, so I always tend to get my eye in by grinding the right-hand side first. And this is the other little key feature on my little grinding stick. I've got a little shelf that I can push the back edge of my blade on. That's why I don't radius these edges yet as well. That'll just sit nicely on that little shelf and it'll allow me to push. Another thing that you can do if you're working on a very small blade like this is you use those mole grips again, and it will just give you a bit of extra purchase. Yeah? So I've drifted the belt ever so slightly off the edge of that flatten, and we're going to start grinding our cutting edge. Looking for around, like for a Scandi grind, you're looking at about sort of 12.5 degrees each side, so about 25 degrees in total. That's pretty much one side roughed in, and now the difficult side, the non-dominant side, so the left hand side. I'll flip the belt over that way. And at this stage, it doesn't really matter if you blew it. If that was a finished blade and you blew the tip like that, it softened it, so it's no good at all. I think that might be my bench is burning a little bit. At that stage I normally have a look, make sure that we're sort of centred down it, and what you'll find, because we've forged this, it'll be wider at the thickest point and narrower at the finish point, so the bevel won't necessarily be parallel all the way along. So you don't need to cool it at this stage, but obviously if I was supporting it with my hands, then I definitely would. And normally what I do is I leave a little bit of thickness if I can before I heat treat it, so that it's a bit more less delicate in that heat treatment stage. pretty much got those bevels roughed in now, look. Yeah? And then about that stage, I'm just going to take the rough edge off the back edge. That should be alright. So at this stage, that's completely soft. So if we were to use that for carving, that edge that we've created would just fold over. So it wouldn't be any use to anybody. So what we will do is heat treat it. So there's very technical ways of doing it, and you can use fancy electric kilns, which I do for the proper knives that we make and stuff. But for something like this, the sort of backyard way of doing it is we're going to heat this up until it's cherry red. And obviously cherry red when the sun's shining and cherry red in a dark workshop are two very different temperatures really. So what we'll do is we'll keep an eye on that, heat that up until we think it's somewhere there. And if you're back at home, the easiest way to test it is to get one of these magnets, and when that steel loses its magnetism, that basically means, so here it's still magnetic there, but as soon as it gets to about this stage it loses its magnetism, so it's no longer attracted to the magnet. Now obviously in this colour, in this light you're not going to see it, but that temperature there is the temperature that we need. This temperature up here, where it's started to go all like sort of shiny and crystalline, is almost too hot. So you read in a lot of books, or you quench it when it loses its magnetism, but obviously you don't want to go far beyond that temperature, otherwise you're taking it too hot. You're actually going to be burning any carbon that's in it out of it. So leave that down there to cool down. In fact, we'll leave all of them out now. Don't stand on those bits. You've got to be a bit more careful now because it's thin on the end. You've got does that in the workshop, it scares the hell out of me. You've got to be a bit careful because you can wodge it into the forge and you can bash it into a bit of steel that you might have in there and you'll damage the cutting edge that you've created, so be a bit careful. This is why I personally prefer a gas forge, is because I can put it in that heat and I can see it and I know exactly what temperature it is. If you're shoving it into your charcoal and you can't actually see, then you're more likely to damage that edge. Now we're going to heat that up until it's cherry red, and I couldn't find my metal tin, so I just bought enough oil to heat treat this one blade. And we're going to take it out and we're going to quench it in this oil and harden it. So what we're going to try and do, before we heated it up, we worked it and then we let it cool as slowly as possible to make it as soft as possible. This time we're going to heat it up and we're going to cool it as quickly as possible, which the quickest way of doing it would be to quench it in water, but that would be too fast, it would be too much of a shock for it. So what we do is we quench it in oil, and this is just straight vegetable oil, and that will cool it sufficiently to make it hard, but not so quickly that it's going to make it too brittle or likely to crack. So we've got it nice and red. It's no longer magnetic, so we normally test it and then I put it back in there and heat it back up to that temperature again. And when we dip it, and I've learned from experience the bad way, if you dip it in at an angle, one side of the blade cools quicker than the other and you make these beautiful crook knives. So you want to dip it as vertical as possible, and if you're going to move it in the oil, make sure you move it back and forth rather than just randomly. If you stir it round, you can distort it. So pull it out as quick as possible, quench it in the oil. Now you don't need to harden the tang because it doesn't really need to be hard, so normally what I do is I just dip it up to the point that I actually want the steel to be hard, and normally if you've quenched it properly, and I don't know whether you guys can see, but a lot of black stuff has dropped off the blade and is now at the bottom of the jar. Now that normally means that you've quenched it and what scale has formed has popped off, and that's normally a good sign. So normally what I'd do is I'd do 2 or 3, and I'd actually have another one, or leave that in the oil cooling while the other one's coming out the kiln. But to be honest, if you quenched any more than about 2 or 3 blades, that oil would get too hot. So I normally have a big vat of it. I've got about 20 litres of oil. Alright, so it should be cool enough to touch. If you still can't touch it with your hand, then you need to leave it in the oil longer. So the tang's still a little bit warm. And this is why I always remember to bring a rag with me as well. I'm just going to cool that tang down because I want to be able to hold on to it. So you can see from this blade, I don't know whether you guys can see, but you've got that sort of silver shiny where the scales popped off, and then where we quenched up to, you can see that we've almost got a definite line of where we've got hardened steel and pretty much softish steel for the tang. So that's normally a pretty good sign that we've got it hard. Now, if you're doing proper tools and proper knives, at that stage, after I've quenched, I'd test it on my hardness tester to make sure that I'd actually got it as hard as it should have been. And if it hasn't reached sort of 63, 64 Rockwell, I'd normally do it again to make sure that you've got it as hard as you can, really. Now, you could say, well, you just leave it at that stage because that's good and hard and you'll be able to sharpen it. But it's a bit like glass now. It's really hard, but it's incredibly brittle. So if I stuck that in a block, or I tried to carve with it and use any kind of lateral force, it would just shatter like a piece of glass. So now what we've got to do is we've got to what we call temper it. So that's going to draw some of the hardness out of it, some of the brittleness out of it, and then we're going to make it hard enough so it holds a good edge, but soft enough so that it won't shatter like a piece of glass. Now we'll change grits because we're not really removing any amount of material now, because we're pretty much down to a cutting edge. But I want to polish the bevel. I want to be able to see some temper colours. So we'll polish this back. And at this stage, it's very important that we don't get it hot when we're grinding. Because I want to make sure that it stays nice and hard until we've tempered it to the right colour. And you can probably see it's creating a lot more sort of sparks this time round. That's because it's hardened steel rather than soft steel. And I keep going until I get rid of any scale onto the bevel. Start to see a burr forming on the other side of the bevel now as well. Normally I have my bucket at about here, so I don't have to keep bending down. I couldn't fit my stool in. So the beauty of the variable speed really now it's getting near that cutting edge, I can slow the speed right down. Now obviously if we try to temper directly in that forge. It's far too fierce for that. So what we've got to do is we've got to either temper it with, very carefully with a blowtorch, or we can use a toaster oven, or, to be honest, you probably get your domestic oven, even your one in your kitchen, hot enough to temper this. Probably need to temper it at about 245 to 250 degrees C, something like that. And your home oven will probably do that. So that's not looking too bad. So at that stage, the old school method of doing it was to use a piece of scrap steel that we've heated up. So that bit of steel that we put in, I've got to try and get it out. Lock that on there. Kill that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the back edge of this blade on there. And what that will do will transfer the heat from that red hot block of steel. Oops. If I have the right tongs. It's going to transfer that through the blade towards our cutting edge. So it's important that we do it from the back edge of the knife, and it's important that we concentrate the area where it's thickest first, and then bring it through to the tip. Because obviously if we painted it straight onto the tip, it would go to the colour that we want almost straight away. So it's starting to transform, it's starting to go this straw colour, which is what we're looking for. So you can lay it on the side if you want to transfer a bit more heat through into the thicker parts of the steel. So I'm trying to soften that tang a little bit as well, so place a bit more heat on there. Now even though that block of steel isn't glowing anymore, it's still got plenty of heat in it to temper this little blade. Can you see the colours yet?
Yeah.
So that's why we brighten the steel, because obviously if that was still all dowdy and whatnot, we wouldn't actually see it. Now I'm aiming for something that's like a straw, dark straw to a purpley colour, something like that. The technical name for it is dark straw to light vermilion. That's what I love that. It sounds great. And that equates to something that's about sort of 57, 58 Rockwell, something like that. Like I say, that tip, I'm being a bit tentative with the tip because I don't want it to get too hot too soon. And you can imagine the longer the blade, the more difficult it is to get it all the same colour. So obviously with a short blade, not too bad. But if you're working on something like Dave works on, you know, a big 10-inch Bowie knife or whatever, you're going to have a lot more trouble doing it this method. That's why it's better to actually do it in an oven. You get a much more thorough job of it, and you're not doing it by eye, you're doing it by a set temperature. Hey, Barry, you alright? So it's not bad up here, but I'm just putting a little bit more heat down here where it's going to be at its weakest point effectively. You've got this transition of where you've got the plunge of your grind, you've got the step of your sort of tang area, so I'm just making that a little bit softer really. And that's pretty much it really. That's okay, it's simple and you could spend hours doing it, or you could do it in a matter of minutes really, but that gives you the principle of taking round bar, turning it into a bit of flat bar, and then obviously shaping it and grinding it and heat treating it. But in theory you could do all this without actually spending any money really. You could pretty much do it with some barbecue charcoal, an old Hoover for your airflow, some scrap steel from your local quick fit, and then you could probably get by with some tongs and a few old hammers from your local car boot sale, and you could just have a bash really.
You don't have to keep it at that straw temperature for any length of time.
It's one of those things that if you can cook it at a set temperature for much longer, it's a much better job of it. This is why heat treating in this manner, I call it backyard sort of heat treat, because you're trying to let all those particles that are in that steel, all those sort of crystalline structure that you created when you quenched it. You've got all these sort of very brittle little dudes. I always imagine these little guys sort of playing musical statues, or sort of stood on one leg in a really awkward position. And when you're tempering them, you're allowing them to go back into their sort of natural, more relaxed state to make them less likely to snap and break. And obviously that takes time. You know, it takes time for those particles to move. So obviously doing it like that over a matter of minutes is not going to be anywhere near as thorough as cooking it in an oven for 2 hours. Like I normally do 2-hour temper cycles on all the tools. So I put them in for 2 hours at a set temperature, bring them out, test them, pop them back in the oven again for another 2 hours, and that's how I do it. So they've actually cooked for 4 hours, which means it's a proper thorough job. This is a bit cruder, but it'll still work. It'll still hold an edge. And that's pretty much it. It's still pretty warm. I'll just quench it in here, and you can pass it round and have a gander. Don't cut yourself, because it's sharp enough to cut you quite badly actually. But pass that round. There you go. You can see what we've done. But that's the sort of colour you're looking for. Any questions on that? No?
What's that?
What's that?
So I came in.
This little,
yeah.
It's just a scrap bit of steel basically,
Right.
which I heated up in the forge to red hot,
Oh,
and I was just using that as the heat. But to be honest, what I used to use before I had a forge like that for tempering the real crude blades like that was I'd put a plate over a gas cooker, and then you could just lay the blade on the plates, and the gas cooker would heat that up, and it just transfer the heat. If you try and do it direct with a flame, you know, before you know it, one end's blue and the other bit's still stone cold like. But that works quite nicely. That there's the scrap bit of steel method.
When you did the second grind, you could put a proper edge on it at that point.
Yeah, you can put a proper edge on it.
You don't get warping when you're tempering.
You shouldn't do, no. Unless you. The danger is if you go too far with the tempering, you can re-harden it and then have another bash in it. But obviously you've got a much thinner edge, so you might end up having to just blunt it a little bit before you do the hardening it. But that's it, pretty much. Obviously this is quite a technical, you know, big lump of equipment, but like I say, a blowtorch and some fire bricks will get you started, or barbecue charcoal.
Have you ever used like a backyard forge before yourself?
Yeah, before I bought this, for the first few years when I was making tools and stuff, I'd inherited this Victorian treadle forge that I used charcoal on, but unfortunately it had more patches on the bellows than bellows. And then I bought a cope one with a hand crank blower. But what I found was I was sweating more from winding the handle than hammering steel. So I remember going over to this dude. What would I have been? I'd have been about 23, 24, and I went over and it was probably some of the biggest money I'd ever spent on a piece of equipment. This was about 700, 800 quid, something like that. But I went over to buy the smaller one that was like 400 quid. And I could hear my college teacher saying, if you're going to buy a piece of equipment, always buy the next model up, because you'll kick yourself, you know, in years to come. And that's basically what I did with that one, and it's still going strong now. It's just exactly what I want it to do.
How long was that?
So what am I now? That was on 30. I'm looking at you thinking you're the lowest. 33 I am now. So it's had a few good years.
Had it re-upholstered?
No, it's good.